Distinguished delegates, and may it please the court, my name is Angelina Hensley alongside my co-counsel Emma Favela, and we will be answering the 10 Harlan Institute questions in our case today.
In regard to the first question, discuss the role that the Stamp Act played in the relationship between Great Britain and the colonies from 1765 to 1772.
The Stamp Act was an act enacted by the British in retaliation to a large mass of war debt that the British had accumulated specifically after the French and Indian War. Britain created an ignorant tax specifically towards the colonists to replenish their finances that forced colonists to pay for every item that was considered parchment by the means of British sterling that was hard to obtain. This tax was in the form of a stamp and was on almost every type of paper, stemming from licenses and notarized papers to mere stacks of playing cards and dice. It was passed through legislation that the colonists were not a part of, and any individual violating this tax was punished through means that were unfair through unrepresentation within British courts. This caused an immense tension between the colonists and Britain, where it sent a message to colonists that their rights were not of concern and British worries were much more of a priority. This caused dynamics to shift, and colonists' concerns regarding their liberties were now intensified because of this action taken by the British. Regarding the second question, discuss how the colonies, and in particular the Committee of Correspondence, responded to the Tea Act's resolution of 1773.
The Tea Act resolution was essentially an act to allow a drawback of the duties of customs on the exportation of tea to any of His Majesty's colonies or plantations in America. This was essentially to increase the deposit on Bohemian tea and to be sold at the India's Company sales, and to empower the commissioners of the Treasury to grant license to the East India Company and export the duty-free. In response, the colonies began to spread awareness on colonial resistance on the tea. Essentially, they were angered and outrageous. And the Committee of Correspondence addressed this in the Philadelphia Resolutions Act in 1773, in which wrote that the disposal of their own property is the inherent of a free man, that there can be no property in that which another can or right take from his without or our consent, and that the claim of Parliament to tax Americans, in other words, our claim of right of levy contributions of us at our pleasure. Essentially, this document highlighted the colonists' resistance and its importance to fight back. The document further wrote that it's the duty of every American to oppose the attempt. John Adams highlighted the importance in his diary and that the right of the Boston Tea Party, which was in response to the Tea Act. And he wrote that in the last nights of three of the Bohemian cargo things were emptied into the sea. This morning a man wore sails, this magnificent movement of all, and that there is dignity in the majesty of similitude. Ultimately, the destruction of tea was so bold and so daring and so firm, and that infallible, and it must have been so important to its consequences, and it highlighted its history. Adam continues to discuss the doubts that other colonists had during this time, and where they were having to dumping the tea and whether it was the right decision. However, he highlighted that it was the best decision in rebellion, as the colonies could not return the tea due to the acts done by Parliament. Additionally, the Committee of Correspondence and colonies responded in frustration and anger. This resulted in an increase in resistance and rebellion, along with the start of organized meetings to address the unfairness and mistreatment which ultimately led to the Boston Tea Party.
Regarding question 3, discuss how the colonies responded to the Intolerable Acts of 1774.
The Intolerable Acts of 1774 were 3 main acts. These main acts were a direct response to the Boston Tea Parties. These were acts that were significant to the colonies because it influenced many of the loyalists to convert to patriotism. Now, these 3 acts consisted of the Boston Poor Act, the Massachusetts Government Act, along with that had an addition act called the Justice Act, and lastly, the Quartering Act. Now, to go into depth, the Boston Poor Act was passed by Parliament on March 31st of 1774. This act specifically was a direct response to the Boston Tea Party and was enacted to close all Boston ports until the colonies paid off all damages caused in response to the Boston Tea Party. Additionally, the act was to discontinue in such manner and for such time as there mentioned the landing and discharging in landing or shipping of goods, wares, and merchandise at the town within the harbor or in Boston in the province of Massachusetts Bay. The next act that was passed was by Parliament in May 20th of 1774. This was the Massachusetts Government Act, in which the act was an act to better regulating the government of the province of Massachusetts, a bay in New England. The Justice Act was an addition to that in which was passed, which made British officials immune to being prosecuted in criminal courts. Now, the Massachusetts Government Act essentially was an act that allowed Great Britain Parliament to pick and choose which government officials were allowed to be placed in the colonies to regulate colonists and make sure the rebellion and laws were died down and enforced. Additionally, the Justice Act was an extension act to the Massachusetts Government Act, in which the act allowed government officials to be excluded from criminal prosecutions in government courts. Essentially, the patriots were outraged by this and seeing that they could not prosecute government officials and whenever they did wrongs in their crimes. Lastly, the Quartering Act was passed on June 2nd of 1774. This act was for the better providing substantial quarters for officers, soldiers in His Majesty's service in North America. This act enforced that colonies had to provide sufficient quartering of all officers and soldiers in their townships and in their homes. Ultimately, the colonists were outraged by this. The government's right is to be a protector for all its people, and one of its main roles is protecting their voice and private property and natural rights. These three acts violated the colonies' human rights and angered the colonies. Additionally, the colonies responded in a circular letter of the Boston Committee of Correspondence on May 13th of 1774, in which the Boston Committee wrote that the town of Boston is treated in the manner of the most ignominious and cruel and unjust, and that the Parliament must have taken upon them that for their representations of outgoverned and other persons inimical to deeply prejudiced against the inhibitions to try to condemn by an act to punish them and unheard, which would have been a violation of natural justice if they had knowledge to this jurisdiction. Ultimately, the colonies also wrote in the Mecklenburg Resolutions in 1775, in which they addressed that whoever directly abets in any way or form the manner of countenances and uncharged dangerous investigation to our rights, as they claim that Great Britain is now an enemy to this country, to America, and to inherit them is of rights of man. The colonies ultimately declared their independence and that their declaration of self-government and desire to be free from the king, that they noticed the violations and the restrictions that Great Britain was doing was unconstitutional and was unprecedented. This was ultimately a violation of their rights, and they decided to declare their independence from Great Britain and fight for their independence after those discussions.
Regarding the fourth question, discuss how the actions of the Continental Congress in 1774 moved the colonies towards declaring independence.
The Continental Congress was essentially established when the colonies responded to the British policies and restrictions. And during 1774, they established the circular letter of the Boston Committee of Correspondence. This letter was discussed the colonies' recognition of mistreatment and unfairness that the British government had imposed. They also addressed in the Mecklenburg Resolution that Abraham Alexander, which was the chairman, and John McMillan Alexander, who was the secretary, they wrote that they hereby declare that Britain is an enemy to America, and that we hereby declare ourselves free and independent people, and our end of right ought to be sovereign as a self-government association. This was the colony's declaration of independence from Great Britain. Additionally, the committee chamber on July 19, 1774, addressed that all acts of the British Parliament imposing taxes on the colonies are unjust and essentially unconstitutional. According to the head of grievances from John Adams, they also addressed that the Continental Congress had highlighted that the power of making laws for ordering and regulating the internal polity of colonies is within the limits of each colony, and respectively and exclusively vested in the provincial legislature of such colony, and that all statutes ordering or regulating internal policy of said colonies or of any such in any case whatsoever be illegal and void. Ultimately, the Continental Congress shifts towards awareness of unconstitutionality and unfairness to policies in America, declaring its separation from Great Britain and awareness that separation is essential in this situation. Additionally, in the motion of non-exportation and defense highlighted that the constant struggle that the colonies were dealing with in response to Parliament's recent laws, and that the province of the Massachusetts Bay and town of Boston are now suffering and struggling, and the common cause of American freedom, and therefore that it is indispensable in the duty of the colonies to support them by every necessary means and to last extremity. John Adams highlighted that the importance of compromising in political unity between the colonies, which led to the shift between the colonies to working together against Great Britain. Now, to discuss the fifth question. It describes the argument advanced by patriots in pamphlets, speeches, and other writings from 1774 to 1776 that supported declaring independence.
During the years, numerous documents and pamphlets preaching patriot ideals were created and given out spreading the word of liberty. One notable pamphlet written by patriot John Adams, titled The Bill of Rights, a list of grievances written in 1774, created the basis of such pamphlets, where John Adams lists numerous events that occurred between the colonists and Britain, such as acts that were enacted titled An Act to Discontinue the Landing and Shipping of Goods at the Town and Harbor of Boston, an Act for the better regulating the government of Massachusetts Bay, and an Act for the impartial administration of justice in the province of Massachusetts Bay, along with another statute for making more effectual provision for the government of Quebec. But these three acts were merely some items listed by him, as he also references the fact that by force, by the enforcement of the King Henry VIII, colonists may be transported to England and tried there upon accusations for treason and imprisonment or concealment of treason committed in the colonies, and by a late statute, such trials have been directed in cases therein where within these trials the listed rights he mentions within the document are not followed. Adams denounces these laws as cruel and unjust and unconstitutional. Within the document, he further describes them as dangerously destructive of American rights and urges the fact that if this continues, in his words, Americans cannot submit, the basis of this fact of independence. Furthermore, this document written by Adams inspires numerous more to be written, such as Common Sense by Thomas Paine, where in that document, Paine describes the essence of what a tyrannical government is. He then compares this tyranny to the current situation, stating that the blatant power trip the king held, stating, "But where, say some, is the king of America? I'll tell you, friend, he reigns above, and doth not make havoc of mankind like the royal brood of Great Britain, which merely simply urged colonists to make such realizations and fight for independence." Paine also showed compassion towards them, stating that I know it is difficult to get over local or long-standing prejudices, yet if we will suffer ourselves to examine the component parts of the English Constitution, we shall find them to be the base remains of two ancient tyrannies, and explaining how ludicrous and almost such a joke it would be not to revolt for such patriot ideals, stating a pretty state we should soon be in under such a second-hand government, considering what has happened. Men do not change from enemies to friend by the alteration of a name.
Next, to discuss the sixth question, the arguments advanced by loyalists in pamphlets, speeches, and other writings from 1774 to 1776 that opposed declaring independence.
One notable document discussing the loyalist perspectives in the matter would be Taxation No Tyranny, written by Samuel Johnson. Within this document, Samuel urges that the colonists should not want to declare independence. He criticizes the colonists, saying that being upset at the British for their actions such as taxation is ludicrous because in his words, of this kind is the position that the supreme power of every community has the right of requiring from all its subjects such contributions as are necessary to the public safety or public prosperity, meaning that the supreme power has the right to tax any individual if it is deemed for the greater good, and the colonists should not be upset at this fact. Samuel even goes as far as to say that the concerns brought up by the colonists are stupid and short-lived, stating that these anti-patriotic prejudices are the abortions of folly impregnated by faction, which being produced against the standing order of nature have not strained sufficient for long life. They are born only to scream and perish and leave those to contempt or detestation, whose kindness was employed to nurse them into mischief. In another document titled Plain Truth, a response to common sense written by loyalist James Chalmers, he uses the same connotations as Samuel Johnson. Within his writing, he denounces the criticisms brought up by colonists and instead praises the British monarchy, stating that which with of all its imperfections, referring to the monarchy, is and ever will be the pride and envy of mankind. James even goes as far as to equate the worries brought up by Paine and other colonists simply as a sign of how great the king is, and saying that I will humbly attempt to describe good kings by the following unerring rule. The best princes are constantly culminated by the envying tongues and pens of the most worthless of their subjects. Furthermore, James even discusses the ideas of what a true democracy is, and that the true democracy the colonists are wanting, and is warning them of the potential harm and disaster from such a true democracy. And he describes there never existed nor will ever exist a real democracy in the world. If we examine the republics of Greece and Rome, we ever find them in a state of war, domestic or foreign, meaning that if the colonists do end up in a democracy, they will simply endure constant war and chaos, almost as a scare tactic to cause colonists to oppose the idea of independence.
Now, to discuss the seventh question, discuss the Continental Congress efforts of reconciliation with Great Britain in 1775.
In a formal and almost welcoming document titled Second Petition from Congress to the King, also known as the Olive Branch Petition, the Continental Congress within this document refers to themselves as His Majesty's faithful subjects, where within the document the Congress petitions to the King. It's stated in the document that the union between our mother country and these colonies and the energy of mild and just government produced benefits so remarkably important and afforded such an assurance of their supremacy and increase that the wonder and envy of other nations were excited, while they beheld Great Britain rising to a power the most extraordinary the world had ever seen, meaning that the relationship between both parties, along with Britain's fair and gentle style of governing, created huge benefits for both sides. These benefits described by the Continental Congress were so impressive and seemed so long-lasting that other nations looked on with amazement and jealousy. They voiced in this document that reconciliation between both sides would be preferred, since this would be a waste of long-lasting and extremely profitable relationship between the two countries. They further urged in the document that the rebellion against Britain was not their own choice, stating that your Majesty's ministers, persevering in their measures and proceeding to open hostilities for enforcing them, have compelled us to arm in our own defense and have engaged us in a controversy so peculiarly abhorrent to the affections of your still faithful colonists, and that the measures taken by the colonists were simply self-defense. Furthermore, in another document titled The Resolutions as adopted by Congress, also from the Continental Congress, they outrightly call the reconciliation offered by Britain as manipulative, stating outrightly the colonists alone have the right to tax themselves, and saying that the colonies of America are entitled to the sole and exclusive privilege of giving and granting their own money. However, it should be noted that even in this document, the colonists are still trying to appease and reconcile with Britain by stating that the desirous and determined as we are to consider in the most dispassionate view every seeming advance towards a reconciliation made by the British Parliament, still hoping that there may be some sort of possibility. regarding the eighth question at hand today, discuss the deliberate of the Continental Congress in June and July 1776 that led to declaring independence.
In 1776, the Congress adopted the Lee Resolution through June and July, declaring its independency. The Lee Resolution essentially had three significant parts to its resolution. It was first drafting the resolution, then it was adopting someone to discuss it, and lastly, the coming together of it. During the times of June and July, the Continental Congress had multiple meetings in discussing the Parliament's restrictions and policies that had influence towards the discussions of Declaration Independency. Additionally, in the Common Sense of Thomas Paine, it discussed how the independence was essential and reached to many colonists to influence this decision. That was a main turning point for the Continental Congress and multiple patriots in discussing that Declaration of Independence is essential in this situation, as the king has noted and has violated multiple of its human rights. Additionally, in the start of 1770, multiple colonists began to become more fearful of their rights of freedom due to Parliament's restrictions. And the Lee Plan was a milestone in its documents that it highlighted that the importance of these united colonies are and of the right out to be free and independent states, and that free and independent states from Great Britain. Essentially, the first main plan of it was to draft and declare its independence. The second was to construct a plan for foreign nations and and to address the foreign relations. And lastly, the third was to address essentially its rebellion against Great Britain and to establish its independence. Additionally, in 1776, they later adopted the Lee Plan officially. During this time, there were many doubts and disputes of its drafting of independence, in which Continental Congress wrote that these united colonies are and of right out to be free and independent states. They are absolved from all alliances to the British Crown, and that political connection between them and the states of Great Britain ought to be totally dissolved. Soon after this, Parliament discussed and drafted its Declaration of Independence, which shifted multiple colonists towards independence and began its drafting committedly. Essentially, this was essential for colonists to discuss, and that the Continental Congress ultimately came to the conclusion that its independence was necessary. The Lee 3 plan was an essential step to this drafting of independence and led to declaring its independence and drafting the Declaration of Independence. Now, to discuss the ninth question, it discusses how the text of Declaration of Independence changed throughout different drafts from June and July of 1776.
When looking at the beginning writings of the Declaration of Independence, there is a huge transition when it comes to the text. For example, in one of the earliest draftings prescribed in a document entitled Fragment of the Composition Draft of the Declaration of Independence, written by Thomas Jefferson, he writes about the emotional breakup with Britain, almost as if more so of a rant rather than a declaration. This fragmented draft shows him struggling and rewriting the very arguments he would use that would later become America's Declaration, that it was separating from Great Britain forever and indefinitely. An example of the unpolishedness evidenced within the document would be Jefferson's farewell rant, and stating that these facts have given the last stab to agonizing affection, and manly spirit buds us to renounce forever these unfeeling brethren. This document is quite the contrary to the last rough draft Jefferson would make of the Declaration of Independence, and a document entitled Jefferson's Original Rough Draft of the Declaration of Independence. Comparing the two documents, the significant change in tone and purpose is established outrightly by Jefferson. Unlike the original fragmented document written where Jefferson writes with emotional intensity, in the rough draft, Jefferson's writing becomes far more formal. and structured. Instead of emotional language, he opens with universal principles, such as we hold these truths to be sacred and undeniable, that all men are created equal and independent. This shift reflects Jefferson's moving from a personal rant towards a more polished national document, where its purpose is the grounds of natural rights and the legitimacy of revolution. Finally, the 10th question. Discuss writings, speeches, and other resources that influenced the Declaration of Independence.
There were many documents throughout this time in which influenced multiple colonists towards drafting for independency. However, the main documents relies under John Locke's essential establishment of second treaties of government and of tyranny, in which John Locke wrote that the difference betwixt the king and a tyrant to consist only in this, that only makes the laws the bounds of his power and good of the public. The end of his government is the other makes to all give way to his own appetite. Essentially, John Locke wrote that the difference between a king and an actual tyrant is whenever the king or tyrant makes laws in which only influences and only empowers him. This was clearly demonstrated throughout this time in which the acts of the Boston Porter Act, the Massachusetts Act, and lastly all of the intolerable acts benefited only the king, such as along with the Stamp Act, these influenced the king only. This essentially enraged and angered the colonists and opened their eyes towards independency. Additionally, John Locke also discussed that when a government abuses its power, it abandons its rights for protecting and of government for his own people. This essentially allows the people to become self-governed in their own government. This document corresponds to the Intolerable Acts and the king's mistreatment towards the colonies. Additionally, Samuel Adams has another document in which the rights to the colonist, which was essential, as in this document, it influenced others additionally in Patrick Henry, in which give me liberty or give me death. These were all inspiring in the use of dramatic literature to establish defense in addressing the violation of the king and his constant parliament actions towards the colonists. This specific document shifted multiple Virginians to become patriots, as it addressed all its violations in its articles, and additionally, it addressed the consequences that would happen if there was no independence. Lastly, the main one was Common Sense by Thomas Paine. This was a major pamphlet and source that influenced towards the Declaration of Independence, as this document specifically was written in such a manner of plain to which all people would understand, not only people working in legislators or in law. This document was a turning point in history as it made multiple loyalists realize the dangers of Great Britain and Parliament's actions. This made more loyalists turn to patriotism and become more rebellious against the Great Britain. Ultimately, all these documents were essential for creating the Declaration of Independence. It highlighted the rights that each colonist has and declaring the ill conduct that Great Britain had.
If there are no delegates, if there are no further questions, we pray that the court now look at our questions with sincerity and love and pray for us and rule in favor of us. Thank you.